those who may be thinking that power windows provides an option here, perhaps. But consider first, is this any way to run a railroad? Furthermore, take a look at this trilinear plot of a discontinuous source. If the color shifts were on a single axis, it would be possible to correct for them, but diverging as they do, there is little that can be done, as a correction of one condition in one direction exacerbates other conditions. Of course, if at any time the director of photography consciously and deliberately selects any of these consequences, they are immediately transformed into art. It only remains an artifact if it was imposed by the technology. M.A. Hankins likens us to artists who paint in oils. The makers of motion pictures may be likened to artists who paint in oils. In motion picture studio lighting, great strides have been made in refining and improving the tools, but the basic materials that compare with the brushes and pigments of the artist remain the same. Within that metaphor, then, the combination of a tungsten 3200K balanced film stock and a tungsten 3200K light source, or the very close simulation thereof, the default condition, represents the blank white gessoed canvas that an artist confronts as he begins a painting. In the course of executing the painting, he may impose all manner of changes and effects upon that canvas. That, after all, is the essence of art. But he is entitled to expect the blank, pure white canvas as his starting place. A light source differing from the standard studio tungsten source, especially a discontinuous one, will preemptively impose a color cast on the canvas that will be difficult or impossible to subsequently correct. The default condition, then, will be proven by achievement of laboratory aim density, visually represented by the LAD frame you see here. All these patches have the specific density values required for normal exposure and color rendering. In the Esmeralda version, we have many more such metrics. These metrics are actually meaningful and useful in the imaging industry. We really do need meaningful metrics. Bearing in mind, then, that the imaging industry has codified via the ISO standards for daylight and tungsten, we will need at least two indices to replace the inappropriate and meaningless CCT and CRI. One index to reference solely the power function, and still others to reference the color rendering of various devices, i.e. differing film stocks and electronic cameras. Taking the power function first, and it's by far the easiest, I'm now in a position to suggest a studio tungsten simulating index, the STSI. One possible implementation we're studying is conceptually similar to full spectrum index, the FSI, developed at the Lighting Research Institute at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. The FSI provides a reference of an artificial light source to daylight on a scale in which 0 represents a perfect match for daylight. The STSI implementation we're studying provides a reference of an artificial light source to the standard studio tungsten in the spectral range of 350 nanometers to 690 nanometers, and on a scale of 1 to 100, with 100 being a perfect match. As such, it's absolutely not a color rendering index per se, but a spectral power distribution index. It's only a color rendering index by inference, in that for systems designed to yield optimal color rendering with the black body's standard studio tungsten or daylight source, which encompasses virtually all motion picture imaging systems, an STSI of 100 would, by definition, yield the design color rendering result. However, it's desirable to develop additional sources based on actual color rendering, which will describe the efficacy of a light source camera combination. A singular advantage of the STSI would be that, to the extent that all imaging devices assume studio tungsten as the design illuminant, a high STSI should perform equally well in all cases, whereas color rendering indices will be source imaging device specific. Thus, the user confronted with a high STSI would not feel obliged to look for further reassurance, while a less than perfect STSI would alert the user to seek confirmation from an additional index, such as a color rendering index, or to simply test the proposed source. To further our understanding of such indices, we dispatched Council Staff Imaging Engineer Scott Dyer to the National Institute of Standards and Technology to consult with Wendy Davis of their staff. I mentioned also powerful simulation tools we're developing. We'll explore these in more detail a little later, but let's just take a brief glimpse now. You can see the actual color rendering changes being wrought by the alteration of the spectral power distribution in the graph below. But as helpful as such indices may be in assisting in the selection of lighting instruments, they are not the ultimate goal of our work. The ultimate goal is simply to ensure that a new technology such as LEDs or plasma or whatever may lie in our future actually advances the art form to a new level. In short, to make it work. To that end, we actively research the field of solid-state light. We increase our knowledge on a daily basis with research in the technical literature, patent application literature, and hands-on research on the devices themselves. From the patent application literature, we have built a database of nearly 1,000 of the most relevant applications. This allows us to do some statistical research that indicates the direction industry is taking. Here are some examples. This graph shows the frequency of references to various wavelengths in the patent application literature. For photographic applications, the regions around 450 nanometers, 550 nanometers, and from 625 to 650 nanometers would be significant. There's clearly a lack of emphasis on the red region, just as there historically was with fluorescence. In this graph, we show the frequency of references to color temperatures, where, of course, 3200K would be of interest to photography. As we can see, there's little interest in 3200K. Though rare, there are occasional papers that show an understanding of the issues. This one by Sukauskas et al. Is such an example. This research is encouraging in that it suggests that if sufficient effort were directed toward the production of a relatively continuous spectral power distribution at 3200K, we may well get there. In fact, in the case of one newly introduced LED plus phosphor device, it's been essentially achieved. This graphic illustrates the evolution that's occurred over the past 2 years and shows how close we are to emulating the tungsten line with such a device. The research is discouraging, on the other hand, in that for the direct emitter, we're nowhere near that close. And there really doesn't seem to be much evidence of a continuous source as a goal versus the goal of producing as many lumens per watt as possible from a discontinuous source, almost regardless of the color rendering properties. In part, this may be attributable to the fact that the industry's basic mandate is to encourage the conservation of energy. So it funds research to produce light sufficient to see by, though not necessarily to photograph by. This, too, is a reprise of unfortunate history, as Norman Macbeth and Dorothy Nickerson remind us from their 1949 SMPE paper. Unfortunately, only one manufacturer has announced a fluorescent lamp employing this new phosphor in lamps. This is due to the fact that while this red-corrected fluorescent lamp provides a much closer approximation to the spectral energy requirements for film and visual applications, the addition of this red phosphor lowers the overall efficiency of the fluorescent tube enough so that manufacturers at the present time are convinced that maintaining present efficiencies is more important than the color improvement, which they consider to be minor. As Mr. Berra says, it's déjà vu all over again. So the core takeaway from this presentation is that with the Academy's mission being the pursuit of excellence in the arts and sciences of motion pictures, which is usually most evident in our annual extravaganza known as the Oscars, it begins, as we showed all the way back in 1928, with light, the raw material of our vision.